Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be your host and your moderator on our panel today on the subject of why good corporate governance is crucial to the economic development in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'll start by providing you with an overview of today's session, the topics of discussion, and then I'll have the honor to introduce you to our distinguished panel. But please allow me, before I go any further, to actually introduce myself. I was raised in 11 countries at the age of 18. I've got 3 mother tongues and 2 nationalities. More importantly, I've now spent some 25 years living in the Middle East. My spouse is an Arab and my children speak fluent Arabic. So the Middle East is a culture I've been raised in extensively, and it's definitely home. I think this is now my 20th year in Dubai, having started in Abu Dhabi in 1972. Academically and from a governance perspective, I'm a certified board director with the Institute of Directors in Dubai and an accredited board trainer on the Corporate Governance Board Leadership Program with the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, and part of the World Bank. My MBA comes from Lausanne in Switzerland. Professionally, I sit on several boards, including the chairmanship of a fintech, various independent board directors. I sit on the board of a Swiss asset management firm, and more specifically to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I sit on the nominations and remuneration committee of a private equity and asset management firm, so a financial services regulated entity in the kingdom. I'm the managing partner of Governance Creed, a dedicated governance firm. We focus on strengthening boardroom and corporate governance practices and frameworks across the Middle East. I was the founding chief operating officer for the Financial Services Authority of Dubai, one of the 3 core pillars in the establishment of the Dubai International Financial Center. I was subsequently retained to lead the establishment of Abu Dhabi's International Financial Center, Abu Dhabi Global Market. Our session today is the result of a strong collaboration and relationship between the Financial Academy and the GCC Board Director Institute. Our session is also part of a larger program called the Economic Growth Forum, which is a series of events conducted by the Financial Academy. This event is sponsored by the Financial Academy, and on behalf of all our panelists and myself, I do extend our thanks for their support. Our topic today is why is corporate governance crucial in the economic development of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Simple in title, yet potentially complex in terms of implementation. We're wanting to talk about the importance of good governance, the impact of good governance on resources and employment opportunities. And the third point relates to a recent announcement made by our leadership in the kingdom and an article published in The Economist some 72 hours ago, the ambition to achieve an annual foreign direct investment by 2030 of over $100 billion per year. So our third point is going to relate to the importance of transparency, accountability, shareholder protection mechanisms, so as to allow us to be able to attract that foreign direct investment into the kingdom. Moving on to our panelists today, I have both the privilege and the honor to introduce you to an outstanding panel of experts. And I'll start with Dr. Mariam Ficciocchiello, and I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Dr. Mariam is the Chief Governance Officer at the Red Sea Development Company and AMLA, and leads the corporate governance, the risk, and the compliance for both. She looks into best practices and frameworks and gaps, and currently looks at gaps that may impact any foreign direct potential investment into the kingdom. She has a PhD from the London School of Economics in Innovation and Organizational Change, and also a master's degree from the LSE as well. She's a Risk and Audit Committee member for the Royal Commission of Riyadh City, and she's a Risk Management Committee member of the Health Sector Transformation Program. As we discussed earlier on before we started, she's also an audit committee member of the Royal Commission for Al Ula, and was formerly a governance director with PwC's Risk Assurance Services. Dr. Miriam, thank you so much for joining us today. Our second panelist is Dr. Basma, who is the Chief Executive of Behavioral Management. She looks into the importance of good governance, human behavior, the implementation of good governance, what seems to be the trends being picked up on boards, and the barriers that prevent companies from being more sustainable. She's an industrial advisory board member at the College of Business Administration at the Prince Sultan University, and she's also a board member of the International Technical Female College in Jeddah. Amongst many other notable roles, she was elected chairwoman, and I say elected by the 20 nations of the G20, for the Female Labour Market Inclusion Committee, and formally joined the International Labour Organization, or the ILO, in Geneva as the representative for Saudi Arabia. Dr. Basma holds a PhD from the American University in Educational Technology, Leadership and Management, and also has a master's degree in special education and learning disabilities. Last, but most definitely not least, she's a certified board director with the GCC Board Director Institute, one of our events partners today. Dr. Basma, thank you so much for having found the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Finally, our third panelist is Mr. Andrew Steele, who is the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at Fitch Ratings. He focuses on the investment side, what companies should do to attract more investment, sustainable finance, and the more common trends investors consider before making any investment. Andrew actually conceptualized and then created the first integrated ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance scoring system specifically for credit ratings, and then devised a way to fully integrate ESG into credit research. Fitch, I believe, has now more than 1,400 credit analysts monitoring and maintaining over 140,000 unique ESG scores for over 10,000 entities globally. And to Fitch's credit, I believe Fitch was actually named the most transparent credit rating agency for ESG by some key industrial publications. And I think that was for the last 3 years running. On the private side, Andrew is a trustee of the Great Ormond Street Hospital charity. He was an advisory board member for energy research at Bristol University and was an independent expert for over 5 years for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, advising on energy security and sustainable energy. Lastly, amongst many other notable activities, both Andrew and Miriam also work at PwC, one of my old firms. Andrew holds a BA in psychology from the University of Bristol, and he's got a certificate in global management and business administration from INSEAD. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us from London. I believe Miriam is joining us from Glasgow, and I think Dr. Basma is joining us from Saudi.
Sure.
Moving on to audience questions. The most important part of our debate today is you, our audience. Now, whilst this panel is going to be taking place via video conference, we do have the ability for the audience to submit questions to our events team who are supporting us from behind the scenes. So I will endeavor to provide all our panelists with the opportunity to answer as many of your questions as possible. So my only request to you, the audience, is please do submit your questions via the chat platform that you are currently using, and these will be relayed to us. Having completed our introductions, I'm now going to turn to our panelists, and I'm going to start with our very first question to get the ball rolling. And I'm going to ask you, how has corporate governance and the role of the board evolved in the kingdom in the last 10 years? Would somebody like to start? Dr. Basma?
Okay. Well, in the past 10 years, well, a lot as more and more of the policies have been changing, looking into best practices and trying to match global standards to open up Saudi as part of Vision 2030 for foreign investment. So a lot of the corporate governors, a lot of policies that support also the businesses in general have been changing at a very fast pace the past several years.
Miriam, do you reflect the same sorts of thoughts?
Yeah, look, I started working in the governance field in Saudi Arabia around 2012. And I saw a huge change over the last few years being on the other side of the table. I think earlier on, we used to see a lot of people getting nominated to board memberships based on social ties and also based on certain circles. But I'm really glad to see that not only the board nominations have changed in terms of who's being nominated, there's a much bigger pool, and that pool is no longer based on who you know and or seen as an honorary role. It's seen more as in terms of merit and what you can really bring to the table. So that's just in terms of nominations and bringing the right people on boards. But also just in general, I think in the last 10 to 12 years, we've seen a huge improvement in on the regulatory side, which of course is a top-down approach to ensuring that we have the right frameworks, but also on a public level too, which I'm really pleased to see. Vision 2030 talks about, and that was of course published in 2016, talks about governance. And if you have the strategy of the country addressing governance and talking about the importance of governance, you can only imagine what tone that has set at the top for us. And so we're seeing, governance in the widest interpretations across the country. I was actually very pleased a few years ago when I started hearing the word being used, maybe not in the right way, but still it's being used. So it became part of the culture of many organizations, not only in the private sector where people are a bit more forced to have good governance in place for purposes of financial, getting the right financial investments or, for purposes of reporting. But in the public sector, once you have good governance in the public sector, it means you've really changed a society, you've really changed a country. So I'm really pleased with everything I've been seeing in the last few years to the small level of just seeing people's LinkedIn profiles saying that they work in governance or they work in governance, risk, and compliance. I'm just like, wow, people are now using this jargon. It's become a word, and it's much more known. And I think that shows cultural transformation, which is where we want to be.
So if I can summarize that, there's three main areas. One is a strong support from government in terms of their 2030 vision and corporate governance, that being the first one. The second one being stronger regulatory oversight and involvement in terms of rules, laws, and regulations. And then the third point that you've raised, and it could possibly be a subject of discussion further on in our discussions, is the skill set mix requirements for the construction of boards of directors in the kingdom. That being more associated now with the skills that are actually required and the teamwork that's required from a board, rather than, as we would probably have known it a few years ago, the social network approach. Andrew, what are investors looking for when they invest in countries like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, well, I think it ties into some of what's been discussed so far, and the government direction and the frameworks are a great start. And maybe to your 3 points that you had there, I might add a fourth, which is I think one of the developments over the last few years is there's very clearly much more openness and discussion, so that aids transparency. And ultimately, what investors want to see is they want to see transparency when they're investing in a country. They want to see clear and understandable direction. They do not like sudden changes. And so that more detailed view from government, together with clear and detailed frameworks, it sets a really good groundwork for investment. And then when it comes to the companies themselves, then clearly, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this during this session, it is very much about how those businesses and companies are run. And the transparency is all important there. But then to the point that Miriam was making, also the quality and the composition of the people who are actually running those companies is really key for investors. And the simple reason for that is if you look at how credit profiles are influenced, by far the biggest influence is governance when you look at different risk factors. And that's well known to investors, and it's been known for a very long time.
Thank you, Andrew. Dr. Basma, in your opinion, why do you think good corporate governance is crucial for the economic development of the kingdom?
As I mentioned earlier, it's crucial because with Vision 2030, diversification away from oil is a key pillar. And so when you're opening up to foreign investment, being so far away from their investment, they want to make sure what are the regulations in Saudi. They want to know that it's transparent, there's accountability, things are clear, that they can see in the future how they're going to run the business, if they wanted to exit the business, to expand, and so forth. And also running the board and the company within and creating that culture. So especially if you're bringing in foreign investments, you're blending cultures of running business outside and then bringing it into local culture with local talent. And so there's always that multicultural, let's say, integration. And as people know, culture eats strategy for lunch, and I say sometimes breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So that by itself, you need to know that there is a corporate governance that is going to put everything together and will not hinder the growth of the business.
You sit on several boards, and Dr. Mariam earlier on mentioned that she'd seen an evolution in terms of the skill sets around boards in Saudi. Do you share that view? Have you seen that as well?
Yes, when I started in the corporate world in 2004, I was a consultant at Sabola, and one of my first assignments was to go over the corporate governors as they were editing at the final stage. And at the time, not a lot of companies were keen on having the corporate governor, so they were a bit advanced at the time. And so definitely the skill sets weren't there, and now more and more people are getting into it. But it's not just about having the skill set, it's about actually implementing the corporate governance later on and having the behaviors of everybody, in whether in the board, the top management, and all the way down to the smallest position in the company fall within this corporate governance. So writing it and approving it is one thing, implementing it is something else.
Dr. Basma, I love what you just said, that there is definitely an evolutionary curve for corporate governance in the kingdom. And just like anywhere else, it would start with awareness, then move on to implementation. Then we're going to have the implementation recognition in our credit ratings. And then finally, it's going to have an impact on FDI. Where do you think we are in that process?
I think depending on who you're talking to, if you're talking to more advanced companies that have been listed for a while, then they have the capabilities and they have the resources to get the best knowledge, if not locally, internationally. So they would be moving faster. But then don't forget that in the region, SMEs represent a big portion of the businesses. So not everybody stands at the same level of knowledge or experience or maturity. So it really depends who's running the company. Are we talking, if it's family businesses as well, is a huge portion of business here. Is it first generation? Are we second or third generation? So there's a lot of other components that really come into play, and you can't just, it's not one size fits all, really. So it really depends on the maturity of the board and the company itself.
You're a behavioralist in one of your previous background experiences. I would love to learn about the intergenerational transition issue, and that might be something that we can have a chat about in half an hour. Dr. Miriam, would you agree with the phases that we're in at this present moment in time? So we've moved past the strong awareness, we're in the middle of implementation?
Absolutely. I think, I agree with everything that Dr. Basma has said, and yeah, definitely we're in implementation. I think, what's the phase after implementation that you set out just now?
Well, the phase after that is then me asking Andrew whether or not we're actually seeing the recognition in any of our credit ratings yet. Because one thing is generating the awareness, and I think we've all done that in the last 10 years. I think we're all in agreement that we're at some point in the implementation. Andrew, has
Yeah.
this started to be reflected in any of our credit ratings?
I think so. Yes. I mean, the important thing to recognise about governance when it comes to credit assessment for both investors and the agencies that provide the credit ratings is that the way in which investors look at this is unidirectional. So bad governance will damage your credit. Good governance will not hinder it, but it's not going to enhance it. So, what in particularly fixed income investors. So there is a difference between equity investors and debt investors, but debt investors in particular are focused at trying to avoid downside risk. And so when it comes to looking at governance as a debt investor, anything which they highlight or find or recognize as being a risk on the governance side, and not following practices, not maybe having the right structure in place, will automatically cause that investor to expect a higher return from their investment, or ultimately it will lead to a point at which they won't want to invest, because a lot of investors are global nowadays, and they will just look at things and say, well, actually, I don't want to be exposed to this type of downside risk. And so the journey that you've talked about that companies are on within Saudi is actually a very important one, and it does make a substantial difference to how foreign direct investors look at the investment prospects for entities within the company. And so best practices are very, very important.
If I may add to that,
let's go from the global basis back down to a regional basis. Dr. Miriam, what's the importance to the kingdom of such projects, mega projects like the Red Sea Development Company?
So the Red Sea Development Company is one of the programs or one of the projects under the Public Investment Fund, and the Public Investment Fund is one of the programs that are implementing and driving Vision 2030. As you all know, just as a context, Vision 2030 is Saudi Arabia's ambitious strategy that was set out publicly and transparently to the world as what we plan to do to diversify our economy away from oil. And in that vision, we clearly state things around sustainability, so social, economic, and environmental sustainability. We talk about regulatory reform, social reform, economic reform to improve our sustainable non-oil revenue sources. And also we talk about governance, which is something I'm very pleased about. So we started off in the Red Sea Development Company in the planning phases as early as 2016. We became a company under companies law in 2018. And we started off with a very clear ambition to bring in non-oil revenue. And so we're a tourism destination, and that's our focus. And we of course embedded, or we have as part of what we do, sustainability is a very important kind of tenet of everything we do. And so you'll see from our social media that we have a huge focus on environmental sustainability, economic and social sustainability. And I could give a bit more detail on that, but I think for me, being in governance, I'm very pleased that we've been able to also transparently tell everyone what we've been doing. We issued our first sustainability report that is GRI accredited just this year for 2020, and we hope to continue doing that every year. Not only to transparently share what we're doing as one of the programs of Vision 2030, but also we want to be held accountable for everything we promised to deliver and how we're delivering against those promises.
Thank you. So we've talked about the evolution of governance in the kingdom. We've talked about the changing skill set mixes. We've talked about some of the regulatory approaches so far. Dr. Basma, human behavior. how does that need to evolve and change in the region so that we can implement good governance?
A lot of awareness and a lot of policy making that has behavior in sight. So how do you architect choices? How do you design policy to nudge certain behaviors, whether within the organization or the private sector in general, or foreign investment? So writing policies with those behaviors in mind, I think is crucial for the next phase that we're going into. Behavior is something that is not always rational, and reality has shown that you can have a policy written, but it might cause a completely different a different behavior than intended, or it might cause the wrong or the right. So you really need to study the behaviors and where do we want to go and write the policies and the governance accordingly. And sometimes if you over-regulate or if you are too strict in it, you are killing innovation and killing creativity. If you're too loose, you find loopholes. And so there's a lot of gray areas, and you want to make sure that you minimize those gray areas without paralyzing the innovation and creativity of individuals and their behavior.
You've been a strong driving force for many years behind equality, and specifically gender equality. Are we now starting to see the evolution of boards in terms of gender mix in the kingdom?
Gender mix in the corporate levels and C-levels and below, yes. Is it fast enough? No. On the board level, it's still difficult to find enough females or to find boards that are interested in having females. So there's a lot of talk about it. Action is still minimal. Some claim, and this is something that's not just about the region. I visited Germany a couple of years back, and when they announced a quota for C-level boards and females, they were complaining they can't find women that are qualified. And so I think it's just any change will find resistance in any culture. I think here the lack of networking between men and women and the opportunities for them to discover that there are women that are qualified to be on boards and knowing how to reach them, I think is an issue. Networking is still an important part of landing a position as a board. Although I agree with Dr. Mariam, there has been more effort to getting executive search agencies and so forth to help in finding qualified people. I believe that not every man that took a position in board was extremely qualified when they first took the position. They were mentored into it and they kind of grew and gained the experience. So I think we need to still keep that mindset as well, that, you know, we need to just open and really take actions forward with trying to find women and position them in the board of directors.
Andrew, does any of the Fitch ratings take into account gender diversity on boards?
It does, because there's an awful lot of research that shows that the greater the diversity you have, the better decision making you can achieve. And so it is important, but I think Dr. Basma makes a very valid point, which is this is not just a problem for Saudi. I mean, it is a problem for Saudi, but it also exists in all sorts of industry sectors around the world. The one that I'm in, for instance, definitely suffers from that problem at a senior level. And so whilst I know it's very clearly identified, it's perhaps not as unique as you might think it is, and you do see it all over the place, and it does affect our credit ratings. You know, we have instances of entities that have suffered some fairly severe credit impacts from poor governance behavior, and it is important though to distinguish between what is poor governance and what is maybe just a bad economic decision when it comes to companies. We spend a lot of time training our analysts on this, because, you know, it's bad governance if you haven't followed the operating policy and procedure. It's bad governance if you've had too much influence from an individual board member in making the decision. It's not been a properly debated or discussed decision. But if it is properly debated and discussed, if it is a decision that's been made from the board and it just goes wrong, then that's a poor economic choice. It's not actually a failure in governance. And it's very important to distinguish between the two.
If I may add to what Andrew was saying about diversity and the research with having women on boards and the profit and all that, I agree. But I think there's there's a myth that as soon as you have a woman on the board, that your profit is going to increase, and that's going to, affect. And so chairmen are like, okay, so we added a woman, and what happened? I've been on board since 2004, anyway, from government, private, and NGO boards, and I can tell you that the culture within the board really makes a difference. So if the chairman, or if it's a family, let's say, or if it's just whatever board it is, if the culture there is to not really disagree or not be diverse. So diversity is not just about gender within the board, it's about really having diverse thoughts, diverse types of styles in negotiating and bringing and being the devil's advocate. And you have to have the appetite for that in the board's culture, or else it really doesn't matter if you have 10 women on the board. And in most boards, I'm usually the only woman there. But it's really about the dynamic. I've seen boards where men are extremely quiet the whole meeting. I don't hear any input from them because some are just concerned about keeping their position in the board, and especially if they're an independent a board member. If you're talking about family-owned boards, how much is that family member allowing the independent board director to really bring input, or is it, it's our business, our money, just say yes or agree or disagree quietly? So it goes really beyond what is written, again, as a corporate governance. It really goes with the behaviors and the culture of that board. Do you want diversity as a look? Or do you really want diversity as a thought and negotiation and discussions to move forward? So I want to kind of dismiss the myth that if you appoint a director that's a female, your profit is going to jump. Not necessarily. It really depends. Are you really after diversity truly, or just a look? Ticking the box?
The role of independent directors is an extremely important one. And it's one that does have a significant influence when we come to look at things from a credit rating perspective. And we have numerous examples around the world where we have credit ratings restrained by the lack of independence of the independent directors on the board. Just as Dr. Basma was saying, I can think of a couple of very large German entities whose ratings are constrained because of that, because there isn't true independence. And so you don't get that diversity of discussion that Dr. Basma was discussing.
If I can add to that, I think that I absolutely agree with what my fellow panelists have said, but also diversity in age. I think it's absolutely necessary to not only have the gender diversity, but the age diversity. And we see more and more young people leading in Saudi, which I really appreciate. Vision 2030 did talk about opportunities for everyone. It makes mention of men and women, young and old, so that they can contribute to the best of their abilities. And I'm so pleased to see, even at COP26 over the last week, that a lot of the Saudi negotiators are females, but young females and young men as well. And I haven't seen that age diversity in any of the other countries participating at COP. And that just reflects really what's happening back at home. We have youngsters in all levels of government, private and public sector that are on the table talking about what's important to them. And I think that really is proof that Vision 2030 is definitely going or is happening, and we're seeing it in action.
Dr. Basma, you insinuated earlier on the cultural change, maybe from some of our historical values that we used to have in the region to gender diversity and taking into account the better team making that a mixed board would make. Are you starting to see strong changes happen in the kingdom? Are we well on the way to that?
To having a mixed board, or to having a mixed work environment? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Both. Are we starting to see a cultural change that will allow us to have those mixed boards, those diverse views, that youth that Dr. Miriam just mentioned?
Definitely, there's the youth are coming in very strong, and there's a lot of acceptance of them, and they are holding important positions. There is gender diversity as well in companies and in boards in a very limited capacity, I would say. There's interest for it. But the culture is changing, but keeping up with that culture and ensuring that the culture within an organization is accepting of this. Don't forget that for the longest time, genders were segregated in Saudi. So the culture was not used to, as a corporation, let's just take it as an entity of an organization. They're not used to having a female boss, or they're not used to integrating in meetings with females or working on projects. All this is happening new and in a fast pace, which is great, but we need to really prepare the mindsets of these individuals in organizations, starting from the leadership, starting from CEOs, HRs, all the different departments, and the females themselves. So we do a lot of awareness and culture assessments from a behavior perspective. And usually, unfortunately, what happens is CEOs say, okay, we're integrating diversity. We want to increase and go with Vision 2030, increase women participation. And they throw that to HR. And really, this is one of the things that does not go under HR. Culture change does not go under HR. HR is an important partner in culture change, but cannot lead culture change. It has to go under CEO. It has to go under the board, especially if we're talking about the gender diversity and the dashboards. This has to be at the highest level. It cannot be thrown to HR. And so there's a lot of, let's say, uncharted territory. They don't know how to behave with one another. So we're going down to the next level. So we have policies in place. How do you integrate? How do you have women and men communicate and work together in a proper professional manner after so many years of not working together? And this needs a lot of awareness to make sure that we don't run into any problems that sets us back.
Thank you. Andrew, if I ask you to put on the hat of a global investor, and I look at the ambitions that the kingdom has in terms of its Vision 2030, what are the top 3 areas that they need to focus on to be able to try and ensure that they can attract that $100 billion per year in terms of FDI?
Well, that's not a tricky question, is it really? But we'll have a stab at the sort of top 3 areas. I think, and I would say this because of the role I'm in, but fundamentally the issues around sustainability and environmental, social, and governance risks do need to be addressed. The kingdom has come under criticism because of being a hydrocarbon-based economy, and also I think slightly unfairly criticism about not moving fast enough on that. And I do think that there will be some rebalancing of that view in the international investment community over time, because the role that hydrocarbons play is not going to suddenly disappear. And over time, in fact, if you look at the substitutes and the technological innovations that have happened so far, the trajectory is nothing like as rapid as people are predicting it will be, unless they're prepared to suddenly have very, very dramatic changes in a lot of everyday goods and processes. And that really has not been flagged at all to the general populations in countries around the world. There's a lot of posturing from developed market economies, but actually the practicalities of implementation are going to be an awful lot slower and an awful lot harder for the population than are being anticipated. I mean, the amount of plastics that are used all over the place, does not indicate that you'll necessarily get as rapid a drop in hydrocarbon consumption as people anticipate. That's my personal view. I should say that. So I think sustainability will be important for investors because, and there it's about being on a journey. It's about being able to show where you are going. And I don't think investors, the more sophisticated ones in particular, expect a sudden change. But what they want to see is they want to see clear guidance and milestones. And to be honest, centrally controlled economies are actually a lot better at providing that once they get going than democracies. Democracies will talk about it an awful lot, and they'll really struggle to make decisions and implement. I think Miriam is joining us from Glasgow. She'll be experiencing some of that, talking about it without having practical science-based methods for getting there. So sustainability, very important. Sorry, you look like you're about to ask me something else, Jan.
The practical implementation side. Let me bounce across to Dr. Miriam. What are the Red Sea developments, best practices and frameworks when it comes to transparency and accountability?
So, I mean, first of all, let me just maybe reflect on what Andrew was saying there. So, at the Red Sea, we've actually committed to a number of things on the environmental and sustainability side, and some of it is not connecting to the national grid for power, which is much cheaper than what we're trying to do. We're 100% renewable. We also plan to have the largest battery facility for renewable energy in the world, and that's all underway. And it's not, it's not something that is cheap or financially, better, but it is the right thing to do, and that's why we're doing it. So, just in terms of your question, Jan, we at the Red Sea Development Company, from the very start, as I mentioned, we're part of Vision 2030, and governance has been always important to us. And so we set out from since 2017 to ensure that we have the right internal controls for the company and the project as we grow. And we built up our own internal controls toolkit, that's what we call it. And we worked with it over the last 4 years as we developed and grew, because we were a startup. So we started 4 years ago, we were, a few people, and now we're about 1,500 people. And we were in startup mode, and we had to go from startup to fully mature mode very quickly. And that internal controls toolkit that we put in place really was what we used COSO as the methodology for that toolkit. And this year we actually made it public. It has all our policies, procedures, DOAs, all the internal controls that you should have in place with a roadmap. And we made it public to Saudi Arabia, to the world, because we really believe that the more we support other entities and other countries, even in improving, especially in the region, their governance, the better it is for all of us. So I would like to invite the viewers and all of you to have a look at it. It's available on our website under governance in our homepage, and it's publicly available with all the tools you need and a roadmap of how to implement it. And you're also welcome to contact us and ask us for support. We really would like to see, better governance across the country and the region, because in the end, it would help us as well.
Thank you very much. Dr. Basma, back to human behavior. What do you think are some of the challenges that we're going to face in terms of trying to get the kingdom to evolve over the next 24, 36 months?
I think communication is an important challenge right now, explaining what is the next couple of months going to look like, and where certain companies should invest and what's coming forward. I think that right now is what companies are looking for, especially post-corona, and how businesses have changed and the needs have changed. I think knowing where that is and where we're going is important. And then communication within the organizations with the changes happening, if corporate governors are being changed or being adapted, policies and changes, all this. So I think moving forward right now, communication on all levels is going to be key to better understand the way forward, internally and externally.
So the awareness and the communication is one thing. Are you actually starting to see behavioral change in some of the boards that you're exposed to? Obviously not the ones that you're sitting on, because you couldn't comment, but
behavior change, yes, from the sense that people are more aware that there's a new normal. There's a new normal from Vision 2030 since it was announced, and now there's a new normal post-corona. So I mean, people have now, I think the behavior has changed, that things are moving quickly, and you need to be fast moving and changing, and you can't just sit still. So I think that from a behavioral perspective has been adapted by companies and by individuals within companies, because as things move fast, if you stand still and resist too much, you're really going to be left behind. So I think that that is being understood by individuals, and people are developing themselves, whether on their own or whether within the organization. So people are really feeling the need to be up to date, to be upskilled, and to go with the changes that are happening globally.
Do we have the boardroom talent that we're going to need in the kingdom to be able to satisfy our 2030 growth visions and be able to attract that FDI investment?
Once again, depending on the board and depending on the company and the maturity level of the individuals on the board. At the end of the day, those attitudes are what composes the board and the culture, and then implement the corporate governance. I've learned through my experience of about 20 years of policy design is you can have the best policies, but then the individuals don't take it up, or you know, you can have individuals' behavior be stronger than policy. So it's how do you merge between the two. So I've seen boards where I've been approached by somebody in a board and saying, can you design something that will make my CEO stop lying? And my question was, does everybody know that he's lying? And like, yeah, but so if everybody's approving that they're lying because they're making good profit at the end of the year, that goes beyond any corporate governance. You can create policies that will let you know that he's lying, or minimize the amount of lying. But if everybody's approving the fact that, you know, CEO's lying in certain ways because they're making the profit, those things, that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying culture and behavior. And how do you merge
starting to see codes of ethics coming in?
Code of ethics, there's always, I mean, there's no one perfect policy that you can write. Every policy has a loophole. In every policy, there's a gray area in there. And sometimes people find ways around it. And so you really, the ethics comes in when you choose those C-levels, when you choose your board of directors. That's when ethics need to come in. That's when you need to look at their values. Do we have those common values? And values are really tested at hard times. So when you don't have the income, or you're not making that profit, and you want to be good to the environment, or you can cut costs by being bad to the environment, which one do you choose? So difficult situations is what really tests your values. And that could be written in your policies, or it could not be. So even if it is, you'll find a way to justify it. So what really stands between good decisions and bad is the values. And this is why it's important when you're choosing those individuals, not after the math and getting everybody that's okay with lying, and then, you know, thinking that writing that policy is going to change, you know, what is that unwritten rules and unwritten culture within an organization or a board of directors.
I think that's something that applies globally. That doesn't just apply to the kingdom.
I was not talking about this for the kingdom. I'm talking about human behavior in general. And this is not just related to the kingdom, but this is, and you can find, there's literature review written about it, you know, everywhere in human and behavior science talks about it. So it's not really at all, I wasn't talking about the kingdom.
Andrew, taking into account the ambitions that the kingdom has, can you give us an example of countries where they've successfully implemented either frameworks or structures that have helped in terms of their economic development?
Well, I'm kind of fascinated by the fact that you say it's helped for their economic development, because I think it does come back a little bit to the concept of what you are trying to achieve and stakeholders. And I think in the past, the boards of companies very much considered the stakeholder to be the shareholder, and that profit was the god to be worshipped. And that has changed dramatically. And very much now it's about value investing. And yes, investors don't want to give up returns, but also they want to make sure that there's a balance for all stakeholders involved. Now we're seeing huge progress in somewhere like China, for instance. It's a little bit difficult to know what that delivers in terms of economics for a country. But again, there, when you're looking at the impacts, you've got to be very careful to think about the very long-term implications. And actually, I think you can distill that from a sort of centrally directed country level, where you set policies and you set guidelines, you introduce standards, and there's some great stuff going on in Saudi. So the Saudi Vision 2030 is extremely laudable, I think, but also you've had Tadawal implementing disclosure guidelines around ESG. You've got the Wealth Fund introducing an ESG framework for investment. So there's lots and lots of stuff going on. But if you think about that and you distill it down to a company level, then when a board is looking at it, it's not that dissimilar. It's about setting clear goals and targets for your business. And you know, I can talk about this from a sustainability perspective, but it applies generally as well. You need to set clear goals and targets. It needs to be measurable. It needs to show the journey that you're on so that you can tell a story around it to investors, because investors are interested in that story. They're interested, you know, they'll invest for the future. It doesn't have to necessarily be perfect today, but what they want to be able to say to their asset owners is, we're supporting a journey. And that journey is a value-based journey that will have an outcome that is beyond just profit.
So let me ask you, how far ahead or behind do you think we are when it comes to sustainable finance in comparison to the West?
Depends on where you're looking at in the West, but I mean, the most developed you find worldwide at the moment is Western Europe and the Nordic countries in particular. In terms of comparing yourself with the rest of the world, I think it's very variable, and you need to be a little bit careful doing that, because it is a journey for people and you have to start somewhere, and the basis of where you're starting, particularly for a hydrocarbon based economy, is fundamentally very different and a lot more challenging than other countries. And there have been a lot of countries that have managed to wave a flag for environmental progress by just outsourcing their footprint elsewhere. And investors are getting smart to this, and they're looking very much at supply chains, and they're looking at it much, much more holistically. So you are very much early stage. There's no doubt about that. And in that respect, yes, you're behind. But being behind, it's not a sprint. This is a marathon, and we're looking for long-term results. And there's a lot of Western economies, I think, that are trying to demonstrate a very quick sprint, but actually their long-term plans and visions are very, very short on detail. And one of the things we were hoping would come out of COP26 would be that there would be a lot more detail around some of these plans. Generally, it's pretty disappointing so far. If you think about the 6th IPCC report that came out earlier this year, it basically said all these net zero targets, all these growth plans that are being put out there need to be accelerated dramatically if their impact is actually going to be felt within a reasonable timescale. And so we were hoping we would see an awful lot more from COP26 as people adjusted timeframes and plans and goals and targets to a 2030 time frame. And in that respect, you know, having a vision for 2030, 50% renewables, level of investment, I think it's extremely ambitious. And it may not solve the world's problems, but you know, it's very clear about what is expected and the ambitions that are there.
Dr. Miriam, you're in the enviable position of heading up the governance for what is held as a beacon in terms of good governance practices in the kingdom. On your experience, where do you think some of the gaps are that exist in the kingdom that might impact foreign direct investment, and how do we plug them?
I agree with a lot of what Andrew said. Yes, we are behind in ESG. Yes, we probably are behind compared to Europe and the world in many aspects of attracting foreign direct investment and sustainable financing, especially. But one thing that I think holds true for Saudi Arabia and also just the MENA region is the pace of change. I think the pace of change in Saudi Arabia is unprecedented anywhere else in the world, especially in Saudi, but I think it goes for the MENA region as well. We have very young populations that are embracing change, and they're the majority. And so the speed at which we're going, I think, is really something exciting, but something that I hope will help us catch up and maybe even exceed where other countries are. And we've seen that happen in a few fronts. So, I mean, to answer your question in short, I think we can do much more in terms of good governance and also in terms of ESG. And I do believe we'll get there, but it will obviously take support from private and public sector, and that's something we do have, at least from the public sector. And it will take, I think, the right leadership from within the different organizations to move us in the right direction. But I believe we'll get there quickly, and we will exceed targets elsewhere. One example I like to recall always is when I came back to Saudi Arabia from living abroad in 2012, the percentage of females in the workforce was 5%. It was actually less than 5%, and there was a target of trying to achieve 5%. This was 2012. Today, the percentage that I'm hearing publicly announced is 27%. There was an article recently that mentioned 30%. So we're between 27 to 30%. And I think that is commendable. We are fast in changing. Maybe we're not where we would like to be, but we're definitely, the pace of change is what we're betting on. And I think hopefully we will get there.
How comfortable are investors feeling? How has their comfort changed in the last 24 months with regards to the Middle East? Are you seeing a shift in their risk appetite? Are you seeing a shift in their comfort levels with regards to investing in the region?
So for us I'll speak for the Red Sea Development Company. We recently, earlier this year, were able to secure the first Riyal denominated green financing at 14.1 billion Riyals. It was a consortium of 4 banks that gave us that financing. And I think that is an example of kind of where things are going, even though it was Saudi banks, not foreign banks. A lot of those banks are associated with international banks. So I believe that with all the reform that's going on and the change, especially in the regulatory reforms that have been announced recently, yes, there is a better appetite. I think the better we report transparently about what we're doing on governance, I think it would help, obviously. And the private sector listed companies have been much better in doing that, but even small businesses and family businesses are moving in that direction, which would help in getting more foreign direct investment. I'm sure you've heard about plans for developing special economic zones from a couple of projects, including the Red Sea Development Company and many other projects. That is one of the enablers for also supporting and enabling more foreign direct investment, because we're hoping to kind of develop a regulatory system in those special economic zones that's familiar to the international investor. And so that we hope will help as well in improving FDI.
We've got 5 minutes left. You just insinuated a potential comparison between the smaller businesses or the family business sector and obviously the state-owned enterprises. Dr. Basma, are you seeing a difference or a two-speed approach in terms of governance between family businesses and state-owned enterprises? And if you are, how big is the gap?
Again, depending on which generation now is leading the family businesses, if the founder is still alive and how conservative they are with the speed of change, we are finding that they are adapting. Some of the family businesses are going IPO as well. There's a lot of IPOs that are happening. So there's an increase in that attempt at least. So with that will come a lot of corporate governors and will come natural changes within the organizations. Are all the family businesses up to the speed of the change? I don't see that they are. And they're struggling to understand what all the different variables that they need to change and keep up, and to translate that into their organization. As well as what I mentioned between the intergenerational changes, there's the youth coming in. Some are not interested to carry on family businesses and want to open something of their own. So the dynamic of family businesses within themselves, there's multiple cultures running in each organization, depending on, again, the generation that's running or the generation that's coming in through doors. So there's a bit of change between IPOs and listed companies and family businesses that I don't think they're up to the same standard or speed of change.
So an open question to the panel. How difficult is the gap between taking a traditional family-run business that might be on its second or third generation in the kingdom and preparing for an IPO with all the governance standards? How big is that gap in the kingdom, and how challenging is it going to be to get that organization ready?
Can I respond to that?
Please, Dr. Miriam.
So during my time at PwC, I was working on family governance, family business governance, which includes not only the corporate governance part of structuring a family business, but also the family ownership protocol, which looks at, inheritance. How are they going to structure themselves from generation to generation? What happens when the first generation or the current generation passes away? How does the business carry on, and how does the ownership structure change? And to be honest, during my time at PwC, year after year, we kept on seeing a huge increase in interest from the family businesses in Saudi and in the region to get support on setting up their family protocols, which I think is shows that there is improvement and there is interest. But you touch upon a point that's very important, which is the gap between how a family business is structured and how a corporate or a non-family run business is structured is huge. It's huge because a family business usually grows organically, and it starts with the founder doing things, in a home-based nature or approach, I guess. And a lot of the policies and the structures that you would find in a corporate are in people's heads. And so a big piece of the transformation for me, at least when I used to advise family businesses, was we need to develop structures and organizations that are beyond who's there right now. And those and that's really what governance and, sustainable governance is all about, right? That we have structures and policies that keep the organization going regardless of who's there today, and so on. And so, yes, I believe there is a gap. I was involved in a number of family businesses that moved from being a small family business to IPOing because they needed the cash flow, and it was a huge transformation. And a big part of the transformation sometimes is the first generation who set up the business stepping back, because sometimes cultural change only happens when new blood comes in, and I think that's something that definitely has to happen. But I think there is progress. There is a big gap between family businesses in the corporate world, but I think on a positive note, there's also a lot of change happening in that domain.
Dr. Basma, would you echo those views?
Excuse me? What is it?
Would you echo those views in terms of first to second generational transition?
Yeah, I was part of the policy change in 2008 when women were allowed to be board of directors in family of businesses, IPOs, and private sector. Up till then, they weren't allowed. So you can just imagine all the years that women were not involved in decision making, did not know where the business was run, and all of a sudden now they're being officially part of it. And being part of it does not mean that the culture's changed. So maybe they will just send them papers and the ladies will sign, but they don't really understand what is the core of the business. So with the family businesses I work with, I've noticed that a lot of the issues also deal with the gender diversity sense of, the women are not truly involved in the decision making and the process or the business itself. And so when they come and put the shares, let's say the founder is still alive and they want to kind of organize the shareholders, are they going to split it according to Sharia law and inheritance law? Or are they going to split it equally across? That by itself a decision that could take months of arguing. And the involvement of the female understanding the business, and then the social fabric that is within the money spending on family events, on family education, all that needs to be governed. And so a lot of the family-owned companies, it's all merged together. And so untangling all this and making it and putting it in a way that makes sense and does not change the lifestyle of everybody involved is also key. And having transparency from the head or maybe the brother that's now running the business is also key. So we've seen family businesses that have gone to court when corporate governors started coming in or the founder passed away. So I think definitely there is a huge gap between what needs to be done and what has been done and what's in the process. But there is interest for sure. I agree with Dr. Mariam.
Andrew, Dr. Mariam, Dr. Basma, and I all talk about the region with a passion. And we're obviously conflicted because this is our home and this is where we live. You represent the international investor. We have an ambition to drive our foreign direct investment in the region. We've talked about skill set mixes. We've talked about diversity on boards. We've talked about not just diversity, but gender and thought diversity. We've discussed regulatory oversight, regulatory developments. We've made comments on ethics and behavior. And there's obviously an ambition associated with the youth in the kingdom as well. What are the 2 or 3 things that we could really focus on to make a difference internationally in terms of the perception of the international investor to come and increase foreign direct investment in this region?
So change is good. It's difficult to achieve because for most people involved with the change, it's often quite a frightening thing to happen because you're not doing things in the way that they used to do. I think I think one of the biggest aspects that has been mentioned, so far is diversity in decision making, and a transparency around that will make a huge difference for investors. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be at the leading edge. What investors are looking for now, as ESG is becoming fully integrated into their investment decisions, the asset owners who are giving them the funds to invest are saying, what I want to understand is I want to understand the impact and the outcomes from my investments that you're making on my behalf. And so that is starting in that, we talked about the more developed markets. That's moving down to a level now where you've got individual investors saying, I want to understand the impact, the outcome from a particular debt instrument. And so if you're thinking about what needs to be done, being able to tell that story, having sort of science-based targets that you can demonstrate that you're working towards, and a commitment to meeting those is going to be absolutely crucial to attracting that sort of 100 billion plus of foreign direct investment a year. So I don't think there's particularly a list of 3 things. It's a kind of combination where don't worry about the perfect. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think you've got a great foundation that is being built in terms of the public direction and the regulation that's coming in, but implementation of that will be key. And to do that, boards need to demonstrate that they are embarking on that journey. And it does involve quite a lot of change and quite a lot of detail. ESG, so environmental, social, governance, risk factors, actual demonstration of implementing a process and procedure around that is very technically complex. It's not easy or simple. It's talked about as if it's very easy and simple, but actually the devil is in the detail.
Dr. Mariam, same question. What do you think are the top 2 or 3 things that we could do within the kingdom, within the region, to provide the international reassurance that our global investors are looking for to be able to come and increase our foreign direct investment?
I think the 3 things are action, action, action. I think we have to start talking about what we want to do, and we have to just do it, and that's what we've been trying to demonstrate at the Red Sea Development Company. If you notice our social media, we're showing you a lot of from the sand and construction that we've been doing all the way now to the different hotel brands that we've signed up with. I think the West, in my view, and the world don't want to hear any more about Saudi Arabia's plans, Saudi Arabia's ambitions. We are very good at announcing those. I think what the world wants to see is action. And I hope that many other entities in Saudi and projects and government bodies demonstrate those, talk about them, explain them, but also do them. I think action is everything that the world wants to see and know, and we need to take action. And I hope that gives the right comfort to the world, because that's where we lack, we're falling behind on. But again, I will reinstate that the pace at which we move is fast, and so hopefully that action even if a bit late, will be fast and will allow us to catch up.
Dr. Mariam, thank you. Dr. Basma, same question. What do you believe the 2 or 3 things are that we could do in the region relatively quickly to change some of the perceptions and attract that foreign direct investment?
I think the word perception is key, and to change perception, we need to understand the human behavior and where they are. So whose perception are we trying to change, and how can we do that? I think a one size fits all is not going to be sustainable. So we can't just be talking to investors and forget about the individuals within organizations that are implementing. We can't be just talking about forgetting that the employees will be implementing things, or the family businesses will be doing the same. So I think diversifying or customizing our communication and policies to the different mindsets, knowing where they are and where we want them to be, and bridging that gap will make the change faster and more sustainable, instead of having to put out fires as we move along. So I think once we align everybody and better understand those behaviors and design the policies and design the communication specifically, I think it'll be more sustainable in the future.
Thank you very, very much. Miriam, Andrew, Dr. Basma, it's been a real pleasure this afternoon. Thank you so much for the input, the insights, your time, your experience. There's obviously a passion around the table in terms of the kingdom and our growth opportunities, where we want to go. Andrew, thank you so very much in terms of giving us the insights on the global investors community. I would love to be able to host this event again in a year's time and follow up on Dr. Mariam's comment of action, 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 and to see whether or not we've actually managed to move this forward, and whether or not your credit ratings in terms of the region and some of our major economies here have actually improved or otherwise. May I ask if any of you have any closing comments that you would like to share?
I spoke last, so that was my comment.
In that case, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Financial Academy, on behalf of the GCC Board Director Institute, can I please thank Dr. Mariam, Andrew Steele, Dr. Basma, formally and officially, for your time and your contribution. It's been a real sincere pleasure. Thank you very much for having joined us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I fed a lot of the questions in from the audience.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. That was slick. I didn't even know that.
That was my part of the job as a moderator.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure, Dr. Bassi.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dr. Basma. Thanks, Jen.
Bye. It was a pleasure.
Andrew, thank you very much. Goodbye.